Okay, so one last point of significance that I would like to present to you has to do with this third bullet here, and that is that we need to be able to stand up for our beliefs, expressing our intellectual autonomy, our status as free thinking beings with all the dignity that that entails. So this one, these two right here really speak to dimension one, whereas this one really speaks to, oh, sorry, this one really speaks to dimension one, and then these two really speak to dimension two. So standing up for ourselves, and then related to that, standing up for our beliefs, but you can see that what is being highlighted here is that our intellectual courage, insofar as dimension two is captured with this bullet point, has something to do with some metaphysical presuppositions that I've got going on here. That is that we are a category of being, an entity that has a particular status in the world, and our status is that of having autonomy in terms of our ideas, our thinking, our viewpoints, and so we need to be able to defend them, present them, and whatnot. We are, in theory, right, we have some kind of freedom to do so. So you can see a little bit of my own philosophy here. I'm not saying that you have to believe what I believe when it comes to freedom or free will. Notice that I'm not talking about political freedom, but that I am saying that we are the kind of being or entity that has some kind of freedom. To what extent we are free, that's possibly debatable, but I am speaking of metaphysical freedom, not political freedom. So on that note, then, what I want to do is I want to focus on the opposites of intellectual courage. So as you know, each intellectual virtue has two opposites, and each opposite is an extreme of some kind. So remember that let me go ahead and do more like a lecture, like we're in class. So we're talking about intellectual courage. So that's a virtue, right? So virtue is a balance between two extremes of behavior. Now, if you have too little of that, which makes you intellectually courageous, then some might say, and I'm not saying you personally. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad, but some might say that if you're in a context where you could express intellectual courage, but you don't have enough of that, which would otherwise make you intellectually courageous, that you might be reflecting an extreme of deficit, right? Having too little of that, which makes you otherwise intellectually courageous. And so we might call that intellectual insecurity, or being intellectually anxious, or intellectual anxiety. And some people would say, depending on the true nature of your lacking of whatever it is that would make you intellectually courageous, some people would say that, well, that person, let's say that person, maybe if I understand that when I say you, I just mean a person, mankind, womankind, that some would say that that person is reflecting intellectual cowardice. So think about how maybe you've used the word coward or cowardly in everyday life, maybe to describe something, that is not of an intellectual nature. So you might say that a mother stepping in front of a car, right, or putting her body in harm's way to protect a child. Let's say somebody's pointing a gun at a bank. She's holding her baby like this, or her baby's in a stroller. Somebody's robbing a bank with a gun, points it towards everybody, in the bank, and the mother puts she puts the cart behind her and puts her body in front of not the cart, but the stroller, let's just say a stroller, then would that be an example of being intellectually courageous? No, it would be courageous, but it's not intellectual courage, because it's not about working through some kind of psychological fear or anxiety about encountering another view or way of thinking. So why did I bring that up? Because now I'm talking about an incorrect definition of intellectual courage. So write that down. That's an incorrect example of intellectual courage. I was talking about the extreme, the opposite of deficit. Of course, that's a vice, not a virtue. And I was talking about how one might reflect intellectual cowardice without enough of that which makes you intellectually courageous. So I think I was going to get into a correct or incorrect example of being intellectually cowardly. So let's say there's a cop in that bank, and that cop is on duty. He's been hired off duty to, keep an eye on the bank and the safety of everyone. And let's say that is his job, right? That if a bank robber comes in, that he's supposed to somehow try to de-escalate the situation and protect people. Let's say that cop runs out of the bank, okay? Would we say that he or she's intellectually cowardly, that he or she is an intellectual coward? No, because that is not a correct example of that. That might be social cowardness. It might be criminal cowardice. I don't know what to call it, honestly, but it's not an example, a correct example of being intellectually cowardly. So that wouldn't count as an opposite of intellectual courage. Now, let's say somebody is in a classroom discussion and the teacher is saying, hey, everyone has to participate in the conversation in class. And if you don't, I'm just throwing in some extra details to make my example work. Your grade is 50% of your grade for today's going to be based on your willingness and ability to share your point of view about, let's say, abortion, whether you're for it or against it. And let me just stop saying your. Let's say Sally. Sally has so much dread and so much anxiety and fear. Let's say she's a Christian and she believes in the Bible, and her real true belief is that it's wrong. She believes in God. She's a Christian, and she believes that the Bible says that you can't do it, that there's textual evidence for the belief that one ought not to get an abortion. But she is so worried about either offending people, but also that people might think she's backwards or make fun of her or judge her in a negative way, that she decides that she'll take the 50-point hit for her grade instead of sharing her views with others. Maybe it's a self-created inner fear or anxiety or insecurity that she has. That would be an example of intellectual cowardice, okay? Not the one about the cop in the bank. All right, so now, what would be on the other side? What might it look like to have the other opposite of intellectual courage, a balance between two extremes, a virtue? So that might be called intellectual foolhardiness. So look up that word so you can know how to spell it. So intellectual foolhardiness is when you have too much of that, which otherwise makes you courageous. So let's just use the example of courage itself. So forget intellectual courage for right now. But let's say a cop gets his gun and the robber is running around the bank. They're just running back and forth in front of the crowd. And the hope of the robber is that if he runs across, the lobby of the bank, back and forth, that the cop won't shoot him because he's hoping that the cop will take into consideration that if he tries to shoot him, he might hit an innocent client or employee of the bank. So the cop is so focused on stopping the robber from carrying on with his task, with his goal, that he doesn't even think about possibly killing other people by aiming at and trying to, shoot dead the robber. And so he just starts shooting at the robber, right? That might be, I'm not saying you have to agree with me, but I think you'll agree that it's at least plausible that we might argue, depending on other details that we could add to this scenario, this thought experiment, that he's expressing or manifesting, reflecting foolhardiness, because he has that too much of that. So he's being reckless with his confidence, reckless with his self-assuredness, reckless with his bravery, right? And who even know if that's always brave? I don't know that bravery and courage are always connected, or that one always entails another. That's an interesting conversation. Now, so in that example, that would be correct example for just courage. But we're talking about intellectual foolhardiness. I meant to be giving an example for foolhardiness. All of that stuff about the cop shooting while the bank robber is going like this, running across the lobby in front of people and employees, that's supposed to be an example of foolhardiness. Having too much of that, which makes you courageous. An extreme of excess of vice. So what I want you to understand also is then, while that might be a correct example for courage all by itself, it's not a correct example for intellectual foolhardiness. I've never really tried to give an example for intellectual foolhardiness because I usually focus on just the opposite extreme of deficit and the virtue. So I'm going to have to actually think about foolhardiness. And I have some ideas, but I don't want to develop them live right now. Okay, so just make sure that you keep in mind, the difference between how we often think about moral virtue, like moral courage, right? And the definitions that you're getting here for important terms. So remember that courage is a very broad concept, and our ideas about courage might connect to what we think about intellectual courage, because of course intellectual courage is a kind of courage. So of course there's going to be a connection, because there's courage and then there's different kinds of courage, including the intellectual kind. So of course there's a connection to the broader concept of courage. But what we're focusing on is intellectual courage. So some of what we say about intellectual courage will be true of courage generally, but it'll still be its own unique kind of courage. And then there'll be other kinds here that, yes, have something in common with courage here, but also have their own unique aspects of what it means to be courageous. So do I want to say anything else about this? No, but I do want to go over some extra credit. So for that, we're going to go back in the slide. So give me just 1 second here. Where's my cursor? Okay, so even though I just elaborated on intellectual courage, the extra credit for the Unit 4 test, or the last test, whatever semester, whatever test you are taking relevant to listening to this video, I've decided that I'm going to have you do some extra credit on intellectual empathy. So again, I know I just lectured on intellectual courage, but we're going to focus on intellectual empathy for the Unit 4 extra credit. Remember, you get 5 extra points up to, but I do grade these rigorously, and I do grade based on how well you understand the lesson. So I did a video lesson on intellectual empathy during Unit 3. Hopefully you took notes on that and you've kept them, and I'm following the instructions that are about to come. So the prompt this time, I've got a different context to which I want you to apply the same concept, intellectual empathy. So a different context, a different situation. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you think you have reflected intellectual empathy in virtue of trying to complete I could say any comparative analysis, but really what I should have said, in virtue of trying to complete, oh, I do have that, okay, the Unit 3 comparative analysis assignment. So that was task 3 of Unit 3, where you had to read through different peer responses and then analyze your response and your peer's response, and then talk about a similarity, in depth. You had to write a paragraph about how your views were similar, and then you had to write a paragraph about how your views were different. So how well did you reflect not only what is considered here and presented here in writing, but what did I lecture on? So you need to, for the extra credit, include information, details from what you see in the slide, but also at least one detail that I mentioned only in the lecture video that I did on intellectual empathy. So you'll use a sentence to present your score and then write at least 3, I would say 5 or 6 is more like it, more sentences that explain why you have rated yourself as you have. Your first sentence will tell me what your score is. So I need an actual sentence. My score, I would rate myself for intellectual empathy during this, or during this activity, or while completing this activity. What is the activity? What score would you give yourself? Then explain it. So here are some ideas that you can use, but then you still need to elaborate on it. What do you mean by far away from rocking it? What do you mean by I rocked it? If you choose 2 through 4, then what label would you give to that number, and why would you label that number as such? So I've already got labels for 1 and 5, so you could come up with something between 2 and 4. So then you have a sentence like that. You definitely need to quote the main definition, and then I'd like for you to pull in words, embed words from the definition, maybe something from here as well. You don't have to speak to both dimensions, but chances are you will. If you want to get more in depth and focus on just one of these dimensions, that is perfectly fine. Also, make sure you write at least a sentence, or at least, I don't want to say at least a sentence, but make sure you give a little context. What did the comparative analysis assignment consist of? What were you supposed to do? And then you think subjectively about your psychology, your attitudes, your mindset, your actual behaviors, and whatnot. How did you actually engage in the activity when it comes to intellectual empathy and completing what was necessary to do the comparative analysis assignment?